Margaret Abernathy pressed her back against the splintered wooden wall, the Pinkertons' revolver aimed directly at little Sarah's temple. The child's whimpering cut through the desert silence like a blade through her heart. "Choose now, Miss Worthington." The detective's voice was granite cold. "Come with us willingly, or this half-breed dies for your sins." The sound of Samuel's sharp intake of breath behind her confirmed what she already knew. There were no good choices left. Margaret's hands trembled as she stared into Sarah's terrified brown eyes, so like her own, yet carrying secrets that could destroy them all. Doc Morehouse dropped his medical bag, instruments scattering across the dusty ground like fallen stars. "Margaret, don't—" "60 seconds," the Pinkerton interrupted, cocking the hammer. The metallic click echoed off the canyon walls like a death knell. How had it come to this? 6 months ago, she'd been Boston's unwanted daughter, traded like cattle to pay her father's debts. Now she held the power to save or damn everyone she'd learned to love. Who would she choose to sacrifice? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, Margaret Abernathy had perfected the art of becoming invisible at her own dinner parties. At 24, she possessed what Boston society whispered about in drawing rooms, a figure that spoke of abundance in a world that worshipped scarcity. Her father, Judge Harrison Abernathy, had made his feelings clear the morning after her latest suitor fled. "God took the rose and left me the thorn." The Abernathy mansion on Beacon Hill stood as testament to old money and older sins. Persian rugs covered mahogany floors that had witnessed 3 generations of power. But Margaret knew the truth behind the gilded frames and crystal chandeliers. Her father's fortune hadn't come from judicial wisdom, it flowed from darker streams that kept respectable Boston from asking uncomfortable questions. "Ladies must be seen, not heard," her governess had drilled into her skull. But Margaret had learned that fat ladies weren't meant to be seen either. She existed in the spaces between conversations, the pause before polite laughter, the moment when gentlemen's eyes slid past her toward more agreeable prospects. 27 suitors had come calling over the years. 27 had found pressing business elsewhere after glimpsing the judge's disappointing investment. Margaret's sanctuary lay hidden in the mansion's east wing, her mother's former medical room, preserved exactly as Constance Abernathy had left it before fever claimed her life. Here, surrounded by leather-bound journals filled with her mother's flowing script, Margaret had taught herself the healing arts that proper ladies weren't supposed to understand. Anatomy texts, herbal remedies, surgical procedures, knowledge that could save lives but would damn her reputation if discovered. The morning everything changed, Margaret was grinding willow bark for headache powder when her father's voice thundered through the house. "Worthless girl! Get down here immediately." His study reeked of whiskey and desperation, 2 scents that had grown stronger over recent months. Judge Abernathy's once commanding presence had withered into something Margaret barely recognized. A man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling beneath mounting debts and dangerous enemies. "There's a man coming to see me today," he announced without preamble, his bloodshot eyes avoiding hers. "Samuel Mackenzie. Owns territory out west that we need to discuss." His hands shook as he poured another drink, amber liquid sloshing over crystal edges. "You'll make yourself presentable and stay silent while we conduct business." Margaret had heard whispers about her father's Western investments. Land grabbed from families who couldn't fight back. Territories stolen through legal manipulation and forged documents. The profits had funded their lifestyle for years, but recently Judge Abernathy had grown paranoid, jumping at shadows and muttering about debts coming due. "What kind of business, Papa?" Margaret's voice barely rose above a whisper. Judge Abernathy's laugh held no warmth. "The kind that might finally make you useful to this family." His words struck like a physical blow, but Margaret had learned long ago that showing pain only encouraged his cruelty. She curtsied silently and retreated, unaware that by sunset her life would belong to a stranger whose name she'd never heard before. The man who entered Judge Abernathy's study that October afternoon defied every expectation Margaret had harbored about Western frontiersmen. Samuel Mackenzie stood tall and lean, his weathered hands clean despite the dust of travel, his dark eyes holding an intelligence that seemed to catalog every detail of the opulent room. He removed his hat with practiced courtesy, revealing prematurely gray hair that spoke of hardships Margaret could only imagine. Judge Abernathy. Sam's voice carried the measured tone of a man accustomed to being heard. I believe we have business to discuss. Margaret pressed herself into the wingback chair her father had indicated, trying to shrink into the expensive fabric as the two men sized each other up like wolves circling territory. The judge's usual bluster seemed diminished in Mackenzie's presence, his hands fidgeting with legal documents that rustled like autumn leaves. Indeed we do. Judge Abernathy cleared his throat. The matter of the territories in question, the land grants you claim, are disputed. Sam's expression remained neutral, but Margaret caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Disputed by whom? My family's been working that valley for 8 years, built homes, raised cattle, buried our dead in that soil. Legal technicalities. The judge waved dismissively. The original claims were improperly filed. The territory reverts to federal oversight, which means it's available for proper development. His voice gained confidence as he settled into familiar legal maneuvering. I have investors interested in mining rights, railroad access, progress, Mr. Mackenzie, something your people wouldn't understand. Margaret watched Sam's jaw clench at the casual dismissal. She'd heard similar conversations before, her father's way of stripping dignity from those he considered beneath him. But this man didn't cower or argue. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a leather portfolio spreading documents across the judge's mahogany desk with methodical precision. These are the original surveys, Sam said quietly, filed properly, witnessed, notarized. This is the water rights documentation. This, he placed a final paper atop the others, is the bill of sale for cattle purchased with money earned from legitimate trade. Judge Abernathy's face flushed as he scanned the documents. Margaret had seen that particular shade of red before. It meant her father was backed into a corner, and cornered men did dangerous things. Forgeries, he declared, but his voice lacked conviction. Any court will see through these crude attempts at— Which court? Sam interrupted smoothly. The one where you've been taking bribes from railroad barons? The one where you sentenced innocent men to work gangs that funnel profits into your personal accounts? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Yes, Mr. Abernathy, I know exactly what kind of judge you are. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She'd suspected her father's corruption, but had never heard it spoken aloud so plainly. The judge's face cycled through emotions, rage, fear, calculation, before settling into something Margaret recognized as desperation. You have no proof, Judge Abernathy said, but his voice had lost its authority. Accusations from a frontier nobody won't— I have receipts, Sam replied, his tone conversational. Names, dates, amounts. Your associates aren't as loyal as you might hope, especially when their own necks are at risk. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly looking less like a simple rancher and more like a predator who'd been playing with his prey. The question is, what are you prepared to offer as restitution? The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Margaret felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, a sense that unseen wheels were turning toward an inevitable conclusion. Her father's gaze flickered to her briefly, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach clench with dread. I have debts, Judge Abernathy said slowly, financial obligations that complicate immediate monetary restitution. I'm not interested in your money, Sam replied. Blood money never spends clean anyway. Then what? The desperation in her father's voice was naked now. What would satisfy your people's claim for justice? Sam's eyes moved to Margaret for the first time since entering the room. His gaze wasn't the familiar mixture of pity and disgust she'd grown accustomed to from men. Instead, she saw curiosity, perhaps even assessment, as if he were evaluating something valuable rather than dismissing something worthless. Traditional restitution, Sam said finally, never taking his eyes off Margaret. Your people took from mine through deception and violence. The old laws demand a life debt, someone from your family to serve among mine until the debt is paid. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as understanding dawned. Her father wasn't just desperate. He was trapped, and like every cornered animal she'd ever known, he was about to sacrifice whatever was weakest to save himself. Very well, Judge Abernathy said, his voice hollow. My daughter will accompany you as settlement for the debt. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but before she could speak, Sam was already standing, extending his hand toward her father with the solemnity of a man concluding a business transaction that would change everything. The journey west stripped away more than just Margaret's familiar surroundings. It peeled back layers of assumption she'd carried her entire life. Sam Mackenzie rode beside her wagon with the easy grace of a man born to the saddle, but his conversation revealed depths that contradicted everything she'd been taught about frontier life. He spoke of Plato and Hippocrates with the same familiarity he showed discussing cattle breeds and weather patterns. You're not what I expected, Margaret ventured on their third day, when the endless prairie had lulled her fear into something resembling curiosity. Sam's weathered face cracked into the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Neither are you, Miss Abernathy. Most Boston ladies would be demanding a return to civilization by now. Most Boston ladies haven't been traded like livestock, Margaret replied, then immediately regretted her bitterness. But Sam's expression didn't change to the familiar discomfort that usually followed her moments of honesty. Your father's a fool, he said simply, but his loss might be our community's gain if you're willing. The settlement that emerged from the desert landscape defied every preconception Margaret had harbored about Western outposts. Where she'd expected crude shacks and lawless chaos, she found a carefully planned community of sturdy buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Gardens flourished despite the harsh climate, and the sound of children's laughter mixed with the purposeful activity of adults going about their daily business. But it was the infirmary that stopped Margaret's heart entirely. The long, low building housed medical equipment that rivaled anything she'd seen in Boston's finest hospitals. Surgical instruments gleamed in organized rows, glass cabinets held labeled medicines, and the sharp scent of carbolic acid spoke of modern antiseptic practices. An elderly man with snow-white hair and intelligent blue eyes looked up from grinding herbs at a marble mortar and pestle. "Sam, you're back," the man said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of education. "And this must be Miss Abernathy." His gaze took in Margaret's travel-stained dress and exhausted expression with professional assessment. "Dr. Elijah Morehouse at your service. Though I suspect you're more familiar with medical matters than most young ladies." Margaret's breath caught. "How could you possibly—" "Your hands," Dr. Morehouse explained gently. "They carry the faint yellow staining of turmeric powder, and there are traces of willow bark under your fingernails. Someone's been practicing herbal medicine." His eyes twinkled with approval. "Your mother's influence, I'd wager. Constance Abernathy was legendary among those of us who believed women could be healers as well as patients." The revelation hit Margaret like a physical blow. "You knew my mother?" "I trained under her for 2 years at Massachusetts General before the medical establishment decided my methods were too progressive," Dr. Morehouse said, his voice carrying old bitterness. Constance was the finest physician I ever knew, regardless of gender. She saved more lives than half the male doctors in Boston combined. Sam had been watching this exchange with growing interest. Morehouse, are you telling me we've acquired a trained medical practitioner? Self-trained, Margaret corrected quickly, fear making her defensive. I only read my mother's journals. I'm not qualified to... Her protest was interrupted by urgent shouting from the courtyard. A young woman burst through the infirmary doors, her face streaked with tears and dust. "Doc Morehouse, come quick! Little Tommy got trampled by the bull. He's bleeding something fierce." Without thinking, Margaret was moving. The injured boy lay in the dirt, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle, bone visible through torn flesh. Blood pooled beneath him while worried adults hovered helplessly. Margaret dropped to her knees beside the child, her hands automatically checking for pulse and breathing while her mind catalogued injuries. "Compound fracture of the tibia," she murmured, slipping into the clinical detachment her mother's journals had taught her. "Severe laceration, possible arterial involvement." She looked up to find Sam and Dr. Morehouse watching her intently. "We need to stop the bleeding immediately and stabilize the fracture, or he'll go into shock." "What do you need?" Sam asked without hesitation. Margaret's training took over. Clean cloth for pressure bandages, laudanum for pain, and something to use as splints. "Dr. Morehouse, do you have silk thread for sutures?" The next hour passed in a blur of controlled urgency. Margaret's hands moved with surprising confidence as she cleaned the wound, set the broken bone, and carefully stitched torn flesh back together. The entire community gathered to watch, but she was only dimly aware of their presence. This was what she'd been born for. Not drawing room conversations or fashionable marriages, but the sacred work of healing. When little Tommy's breathing finally stabilized and color returned to his cheeks, Margaret sat back on her heels, suddenly aware of the blood staining her dress and the ache in her back from bending over the improvised surgical table. The silence around her was absolute. Then Dr. Morehouse began to clap, slowly and deliberately. The applause spread through the crowd until the entire community was celebrating her success. But it was Sam's expression that made Margaret's heart race. He was looking at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Welcome home, Doctor." "Abernathy," he said quietly, and Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. That evening, as she helped Dr. Morehouse organize medical supplies, he shared the truth that would change everything. "This isn't just a settlement, my dear," he said, his voice low and careful. "We're what some folks might call an underground railroad station, but instead of helping escaped slaves, we help women escape from situations where they can't survive." Margaret's hands stilled on the bottles she'd been arranging. What kind of situations? Abusive husbands, fathers who sell their daughters, men who see women as property rather than people. Dr. Morehouse's eyes met hers meaningfully. "Your father isn't the first to try to dispose of an inconvenient daughter by trading her away." The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity. Sam's mysterious knowledge of her father's corruption, the community's immediate acceptance of her presence, the sophisticated medical facility in the middle of nowhere. "You planned this," Margaret breathed. "My father didn't trade me to pay a debt. You specifically requested me." Dr. Morehouse smiled sadly. "Your mother saved my life once, professionally speaking. She hid me when the medical board tried to have me arrested for treating indigent patients. I promised her that if her daughter ever needed sanctuary, I would provide it." His expression grew troubled. "What we didn't expect was how much you'd inherited of her gifts, or how badly you'd need those gifts to save us all." The first month at the settlement transformed Margaret in ways she'd never imagined possible. Her soft Boston hands grew calloused from mixing medicines and tending wounds, while her body strengthened from the physical demands of frontier medicine. But it was the gradual unraveling of her father's lies that proved most shocking. "Your letters never made it past the settlement's edge," Sam confessed one evening as they worked together in the infirmary. "Judge Abernathy specifically requested that we let him handle all correspondence, said he wanted to manage the situation back in Boston." Margaret's hands stilled on the bandages she'd been rolling. "He wanted people to think I was dead." "More convenient that way," Dr. Morehouse added grimly. "Dead daughters can't testify about their father's crimes." The revelation opened floodgates of memory. Her father's increasingly erratic behavior, his paranoid mutterings about loose ends, the way he'd scrutinized every letter she'd ever received or sent. Margaret had attributed his controlling nature to shame about her appearance, but the truth was far more sinister. It was during her second month that Margaret began experiencing the headaches, sharp, stabbing pains that left her nauseated and disoriented, accompanied by a strange metallic taste that reminded her of something she couldn't quite place. Dr. Morehouse noticed her distress during a particularly difficult surgery on a woman who'd arrived with injuries from her husband's fists. "Margaret, you're trembling," he observed, taking the suture needle from her unsteady hands. "When did these symptoms start?" "Recently," she admitted, pressing her fingers to her temples, "but they're getting worse. Sometimes I can barely see straight." Dr. Morehouse's expression grew troubled. "Describe the taste in your mouth." "Metallic, like when I used to help Papa organize his papers in the study." Margaret's voice trailed off as understanding dawned. "The ink. He always insisted I use his special fountain pen when writing correspondence." The blood test Dr. Morehouse conducted confirmed their worst fears. Mercury poisoning, chronic, deliberate, and designed to appear like natural illness. Judge Abernathy had been slowly poisoning his own daughter for years, creating the weight gain and health problems that made her unmarriageable, while simultaneously ensuring she'd be too sick to investigate his activities or pose a threat to his plans. "That bastard!" Sam's voice shook with fury when they shared the results. "He was killing you by degrees." Margaret stared at the test results, pieces of her life rearranging themselves into a horrifying new pattern. "He said I was sickly because of my mother's weak blood. But it was him. All along, it was him." The detoxification process was brutal, but necessary. Under Dr. Morehouse's careful supervision, Margaret endured weeks of treatments designed to purge the mercury from her system. As the poison left her body, remarkable changes occurred. The chronic fatigue that had plagued her for years lifted, her mind cleared, and her natural figure emerged, still full-bodied, but strong and healthy rather than bloated and sick. More importantly, her medical abilities flourished. Free from the mercury's neurological effects, Margaret's diagnostic skills sharpened to an almost supernatural degree. She could identify illness by scent, predict complications before they manifested, and her hands seemed to know instinctively where pain was hiding in patients' bodies. It was during this period of recovery that Sarah Mackenzie arrived at the settlement. The girl was perhaps 16, with dark hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. She'd been traveling with a group of women fleeing a brothel in Denver when their wagon broke down, but something about her seemed familiar to Margaret in a way she couldn't explain. "She's been asking for you specifically," Sam mentioned one evening after Sarah had been at the settlement for a week. "Won't say why, but she seems to know things about your family that she shouldn't." Margaret found Sarah sitting by the creek that evening, braiding strips of leather with practiced fingers. When the girl looked up, Margaret's breath caught. The eyes staring back at her were unmistakably familiar, the same unusual amber-green shade that Margaret saw in her own mirror each morning. "You're my sister," Sarah said without preamble. "Half-sister, technically. Same father, different mothers." The world tilted on its axis. Margaret sank down beside the girl, her mind reeling. "That's impossible. My father never—" Your father has been trafficking women through the territories for 15 years, Sarah interrupted, her voice matter-of-fact despite the horror of her words. My mother was Cherokee, captured during a raid he organized under the guise of relocating hostile natives. She was pregnant with me when she died in his Denver facility. Margaret's hands shook as the implications crashed over her. The business trips, his territorial investments. Dear God, how many women? Hundreds, probably. He's got operations in 6 states, all hidden behind legitimate businesses and legal manipulations. Sarah's voice carried a bitterness that seemed far too mature for her years. I've been tracking him for 3 years, gathering evidence. That's why I came here. I heard he'd sent you away, and I hoped you might have information that could help bring him down. The settlement's cattle operation, Margaret learned, was indeed a cover for something far more significant. Sam's community was part of a larger network of safe houses and rescue operations spanning the entire Western Territory. They intercepted Judge Abernathy's trafficking routes, liberated women from his facilities, and provided them with new identities and safe passage to places where they could rebuild their lives. Your father's operation is sophisticated, Sam explained during one of their evening planning sessions. He uses his legal position to create false documentation, his judicial contacts to avoid prosecution, and his social standing to deflect suspicion. We've been fighting him for years, but he's always stayed one step ahead. Until now, Dr. Morehouse added meaningfully. You carry his blood, know his methods, understand his psychology. You're our best hope of predicting his next moves. Margaret threw herself into the work with desperate intensity. The medical skills she'd developed treating the settlement's inhabitants proved invaluable when dealing with rescued women who'd suffered physical and psychological trauma. But it was her intimate knowledge of her father's psychology that made her truly dangerous to his operation. She remembered conversations overheard through closed doors, patterns in his correspondence, the names of associates who'd visited their Boston home. Most crucially, she understood the financial pressures driving his increasingly reckless behavior. Judge Abernathy was deeply in debt to dangerous men, and his trafficking operation was the only thing keeping him from a violent end. The romance with Sam developed gradually, built on shared purpose and mutual respect rather than the shallow attractions that had characterized her Boston suitors. He saw her as a partner in their dangerous work, valued her medical expertise, and never once made her feel ashamed of her appearance or appetites. Their first kiss happened in the infirmary during their 3rd month together, both of them exhausted from a long surgery on a woman who'd been shot trying to escape her captors. Margaret had expected awkwardness, fumbling, perhaps even disgust on Sam's part. Instead, she found tenderness, passion, and a sense of coming home that left her breathless. I love you, Sam whispered against her forehead later that night as they stood together under the star-filled desert sky. Not despite who you are, but because of who you are. Your strength, your intelligence, your healing hands. You're perfect, exactly as you are. Margaret had never imagined words could heal old wounds, but Sam's declaration seemed to mend something fundamental that had been broken inside her since childhood. For the first time in her life, she felt truly valued for herself rather than judged for her failures to meet impossible standards, but their happiness was shadowed by growing danger. Reports reached the settlement of increased Pinkerton activity in the area, systematic raids on suspected safe houses, and the mysterious disappearance of several network operatives. Judge Abernathy was closing his net, and Margaret realized with growing dread that her presence at the settlement had likely painted a target on everyone she'd come to love. The final piece of the puzzle came when Sarah revealed the contents of a letter she'd intercepted from one of their father's associates. Judge Abernathy had convinced federal authorities that his daughter had been kidnapped by a dangerous cult operating in the territories. Warrants had been issued, reward money posted, and a joint task force of Pinkertons and U.S. Marshals was being assembled to rescue Margaret and arrest her captors. "He's not just coming to get you back," Sarah said grimly. "He's planning to eliminate everyone here as part of his rescue operation. Dead witnesses can't testify about what they've seen." Margaret stared at the letter, her father's familiar handwriting describing the people who'd shown her more love and acceptance than she'd ever known as dangerous criminals and degenerate savages. The man who'd poisoned her for years, who'd built his fortune on human suffering, was positioning himself as her savior while planning the murder of her true family. That night, as she lay in Sam's arms listening to his steady heartbeat, Margaret made a decision that would determine all their fates. Judge Abernathy had underestimated his daughter for the last time. She possessed knowledge that could destroy him, skills that could save the people she loved, and perhaps most dangerously, the cold fury of a woman who'd finally understood the true extent of her father's betrayal. The war between them was about to begin, and Margaret Abernathy intended to win. The dust cloud on the eastern horizon appeared 3 days before anyone expected it, a brown smudge against the pale morning sky that made Sam's jaw clench with recognition. Margaret watched from the infirmary window as he lowered his field glasses, his weathered face grim with the knowledge that their time had run out. "How many?" Dr. Morehouse asked, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands as he continued organizing medical supplies. 20 riders, maybe more. Pinkertons by the look of their formation, with federal marshals bringing up the rear." Sam's eyes found Margaret's across the room. "Your father's not taking any chances this time." The settlement erupted into controlled chaos as families prepared for the siege they'd all known was coming. Children were hustled into the reinforced root cellars while women checked ammunition supplies and men took positions along the carefully constructed defensive perimeter. This wasn't their first confrontation with federal authorities, but everyone understood this time was different. Judge Abernathy had the full weight of the law behind him now. Margaret's hands remained steady as she completed her final preparations in the infirmary, but her mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. Every scenario ended the same way: bloodshed, death, and the destruction of everything they'd built together. Unless she could find a way to turn her father's own tactics against him. "There's something else," Sarah said quietly, appearing at Margaret's elbow with a leather satchel clutched against her chest. "Something I haven't told you about our father's operation." Margaret paused in her inventory of surgical instruments. "What now?" "The trafficking routes don't just move women," Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "They move money, lots of it. Judge Abernathy has been laundering profits from his illegal activities through a network of legitimate businesses, including railroad investments and mining claims." She opened the satchel to reveal stacks of documents, coded ledgers and correspondence bearing official seals. "I've been gathering evidence for 3 years. Names, dates, financial records, testimony from survivors. Enough to bring down not just our father, but his entire network of associates." Margaret stared at the papers, understanding dawning with crystalline clarity. "That's why he's so desperate to get me back. It's not about family honor or even eliminating witnesses. He needs to know what I've learned, what evidence might exist. And now he knows you're with the very people who've been sabotaging his operations," Sam added, having overheard their conversation. "In his mind, you're not his daughter anymore. You're the greatest threat he's ever faced." The sound of hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by the jingle of harnesses and the low murmur of men preparing for violence. Margaret could see individual riders now, their dark clothing and grim expressions leaving no doubt about their intentions. At the head of the column rode a figure she recognized even at distance, Judge Harrison Abernathy, tall and imposing in his black coat, playing the role of grieving father, come to rescue his kidnapped daughter. "Margaret Abernathy!" Her father's voice carried across the desert with the same commanding authority he'd wielded in courtrooms and drawing rooms throughout her life. "I know you can hear me. These people have filled your head with lies, poisoned your mind against your own family. Come out now, and we can settle this without bloodshed." The hypocrisy of his words, spoken by a man who'd built his fortune on violence and exploitation, sent rage coursing through Margaret's veins. She stepped onto the infirmary's porch, making herself visible to the assembled force, and felt a grim satisfaction at seeing her father's confident expression falter. She looked nothing like the soft, sickly daughter he'd sent away 6 months ago. The mercury poisoning's effects had fully reversed, revealing the strong, healthy woman she'd always been beneath the chemical fog he'd imposed. Her hair caught the morning sunlight, her posture radiated confidence, and her eyes held a steel that hadn't been there in Boston. "Hello, Papa," Margaret called back, her voice carrying clearly across the distance. "I see you've brought friends to help with another of your rescue operations. Tell me, how many women have you rescued over the years?" Judge Abernathy's face darkened, but he maintained his performance for the benefit of the federal marshals flanking him. "You're clearly unwell, Margaret. These criminals have obviously drugged you, filled your mind with delusions. Marshal Thompson here has assured me we can handle this situation with minimal violence if you cooperate." The lead marshal, a grizzled man with sergeant's stripes on his sleeve, shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Margaret had the sudden insight that not everyone in the federal force was fully convinced by Judge Abernathy's story. Men who'd spent years enforcing law on the frontier developed instincts about truth and deception, and something about this situation clearly troubled the experienced lawman. "Marshal Thompson," Margaret addressed the man directly, ignoring her father's sharp intake of breath at her presumption. "Has my father shown you the warrants for these people's arrest?" "The specific charges they're supposed to be facing?" "Miss Abernathy," the marshal replied carefully, "your father has convinced federal authorities that you're being held against your will by a dangerous criminal organization. Our orders are to secure your safe return and arrest those responsible for your kidnapping." "Kidnapping?" Margaret repeated, tasting the word like poison. "Marshal, did my father mention that he personally delivered me to this community as payment for debts incurred through his illegal activities? Did he show you the documentation proving this land belongs to these people through legitimate purchase and development?" She reached into her medical bag and withdrew a thick envelope. The papers Sarah had given her, along with additional evidence she'd been gathering during her months at the settlement. "I have here financial records, correspondence, and testimony proving that Judge Harrison Abernathy has been operating human trafficking routes throughout 6 Western territories for over 15 years. I also have medical documentation proving he's been slowly poisoning me with mercury for years to keep me compliant and sickly." The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as the weight of her accusations settled over the assembled riders. Margaret saw doubt creeping into the faces of several federal officers, while her father's carefully constructed mask of righteous authority began to crack. "She's delusional," Judge Abernathy declared, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "The trauma of her captivity has obviously—" "I'm a trained physician, Papa," Margaret interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests like a scalpel. "I've spent the last 6 months treating women who escaped from your facilities. Women who bear the scars of your business operations. Women who can identify you by name and describe in detail the horrors you've subjected them to." Marshal Thompson's expression had grown increasingly grim as Margaret spoke. "Ma'am, these are serious accusations you're making. Do you have proof of these claims?" Margaret held up the envelope. Names, dates, financial records, medical testimony, and written statements from dozens of survivors. Everything you need to prosecute not just my father, but his entire network of associates. She paused, letting the weight of her next words sink in, including several federal officials who've been taking bribes to look the other way. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Several of the Pinkertons reached for their weapons while federal officers shouted conflicting orders. Judge Abernathy's careful facade finally shattered completely as he realized his daughter had become his nemesis rather than his victim. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled, his mask of paternal concern dissolving into the cold fury Margaret remembered from her childhood. "I should have finished what the Mercury started years ago." The admission hung in the air like a physical blow. Even the most skeptical members of the federal force couldn't ignore the implications of the judge's words. But before anyone could react, the crack of a rifle split the morning air. Margaret felt the bullet part the air inches from her head as Judge Abernathy's hand dropped to his side, smoke rising from the derringer he'd concealed beneath his coat. In that instant, the careful standoff dissolved into chaos. Federal officers shouted orders while Pinkertons drew weapons, caught between conflicting loyalties and uncertain about who represented legitimate authority. Sam's voice cut through the confusion like a blade. "Federal officers, the man you're supporting just attempted to murder his own daughter in front of witnesses. We're the ones upholding the law here." Margaret clutched the evidence envelope against her chest as gunfire erupted around her. The next few minutes would determine whether justice would finally catch up with Judge Harrison Abernathy, or whether his web of corruption would claim one final victory over the family he'd destroyed and the community that had given her a chance at real life. The war her father had started 24 years ago with her mother's murder was finally coming to its end, and Margaret intended to be the one left standing when the smoke cleared. The gunshot that shattered the morning silence was followed by a scream that would haunt Margaret's nightmares for years to come. Not her own scream. She had dropped to the ground clutching the evidence envelope, unharmed. But Sarah's cry of agony as Judge Abernathy's second shot found its mark. Margaret's half-sister crumpled to the infirmary steps, blood spreading across her chest in a crimson stain that seemed to expand with each labored breath. The girl who had spent 3 years gathering evidence against their father now lay dying from his bullets, her amber-green eyes wide with shock and pain. "Sarah!" Margaret's medical training overrode her terror as she crawled toward her fallen sister, heedless of the chaos erupting around them. Federal officers and Pinkertons were shouting conflicting orders, while settlement defenders took positions behind hastily constructed barricades. But all Margaret could see was the growing pool of blood beneath Sarah's still form. Judge Abernathy's voice cut through the gunfire with the same commanding authority he'd wielded in courtrooms throughout his career. "Marshal Thompson, that girl was reaching for a weapon. I acted in defense of federal officers. She was 16 years old and unarmed." Dr. Morehouse roared from the infirmary doorway, his face contorted with rage and grief. "You murdered a child in cold blood." Margaret pressed her hands against Sarah's chest wound, feeling warm blood seep between her fingers as she desperately tried to stem the bleeding. The bullet had punctured a lung, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of air escaping through torn tissue. Without immediate surgery, Sarah would drown in her own blood within minutes. "Sam!" Margaret's voice cracked with desperation. "I need to get her inside now." But Sam was pinned down behind an overturned wagon, trading shots with Pinkertons who seemed determined to follow Judge Abernathy's lead, regardless of federal orders. The careful standoff had devolved into a running battle, with Margaret and Sarah trapped in the crossfire between conflicting interpretations of law and justice. Marshal Thompson's voice boomed across the battlefield as he tried to regain control of the situation. "Cease fire! All units, Cease fire immediately. I need to understand what's happening here before anyone else gets killed." The shooting gradually subsided, but the tension remained thick as morning fog. Margaret used the momentary lull to drag Sarah's unconscious form toward the infirmary door, leaving a trail of blood across the wooden planks. Each second that passed without surgery decreased Sarah's chances of survival, and Margaret felt the weight of her sister's life pressing down on her like a physical burden. "Let me help." Marshal Thompson dismounted and approached cautiously, his hands visible and empty. "Miss Abernathy, I've been a lawman for 23 years, and I've never seen a father try to murder his own children. If what you're saying is true—" "It's all true," Margaret gasped, not looking up from Sarah's pale face. "Every word. And if you don't let me save her life right now, you'll lose the key witness who can prove it." Judge Abernathy's laugh was cold and bitter. "Witness to what? The delusions of a traumatized girl who's been brainwashed by criminals? Marshal, I demand you arrest these people immediately and return my daughter to proper medical care." "Your daughter is providing proper medical care," Dr. Morehouse interjected, emerging from the infirmary with surgical instruments and supplies. "She's trying to save the life of the girl you just shot." Margaret's hands moved with desperate efficiency as she cut away Sarah's blood-soaked clothing to expose the wound. The bullet had entered just below the left collarbone, angling downward toward the lung. She could see the entrance wound clearly, but without proper lighting and surgical conditions, attempting to remove the bullet would be nearly impossible. "I need light," Margaret called out, "and someone to hold pressure on this wound while I prepare for surgery." Marshal Thompson stepped forward without hesitation, pressing a clean bandana against Sarah's chest as Margaret had instructed. "Ma'am, I'm not a doctor, but I've seen enough battlefield wounds to know this girl needs more help than we can provide out here." "Then you'd better pray my medical training is better than my father's opinion of it," Margaret replied grimly, accepting surgical instruments from Dr. Morehouse's steady hands. The impromptu surgery that followed would later be described by witnesses as either miraculous or impossible, depending on their medical knowledge. Working with nothing but natural light and basic frontier equipment, Margaret successfully located and removed the bullet that had collapsed Sarah's lung. Her hands moved with precision that seemed supernatural, guided by instincts honed through months of treating trauma victims and years of studying her mother's medical journals. Judge Abernathy watched the procedure with growing horror, perhaps finally understanding that his disappointing daughter had become something far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The weak, pliable girl he'd controlled through poison and psychological manipulation had transformed into a skilled physician capable of saving lives he'd tried to destroy. "She's stabilizing," Dr. Morehouse announced after what felt like hours, but had probably been only 30 minutes. "Pulse is getting stronger. Breathing is easier." "Margaret, you've performed a miracle." But the miracle came at a cost that became apparent only as Margaret stepped back from the makeshift surgical table. The emotional toll of operating on her sister while under threat from their father had pushed her beyond all physical and psychological limits. Her hands, so steady during the surgery, now shook uncontrollably as the full weight of the morning's events crashed down on her. "I can't do this anymore," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling dust and murmured conversations of the watching crowd. "I can't keep fighting him. He'll never stop. He'll keep coming back, keep hurting people, until everyone I love is dead." Sam appeared at her side, blood from a minor graze on his forehead mixing with the dust and sweat that covered his face. "Margaret, you just saved Sarah's life. You proved to everyone here exactly what kind of man your father really is. The federal officers saw him try to murder you and succeed in nearly killing a 16-year-old girl. His own credibility is destroyed." But Margaret barely heard him. The cumulative stress of months of revelation about her father's crimes, The mercury poisoning that had stolen years of her life, the constant threat hanging over the community she'd come to love, all of it combined in a crushing wave of despair that left her gasping for breath. "He poisoned me for years," she said, her voice growing stronger but filled with a bitterness that made Sam's heart ache. "He murdered my mother. He's trafficked hundreds of women. He just tried to kill both his daughters in front of federal witnesses, and somehow he'll still find a way to win. Men like him always do." Judge Abernathy's voice carried across the settling battlefield with renewed confidence, as if Margaret's moment of weakness had restored his sense of control. "You see, Marshall, my daughter is clearly suffering from severe psychological trauma. These people have convinced her that her own father is some kind of monster. She needs proper medical care, not encouragement in these dangerous delusions." The terrible part was that his words carried a grain of twisted logic that might appeal to men unfamiliar with the true scope of his crimes. Margaret could see doubt creeping back into some of the federal officers' faces, the natural tendency to trust established authority over the testimony of traumatized women and frontier settlers. In that moment, standing over her half-sister's still form, with her father's lies echoing across the desert air, Margaret felt the last of her strength drain away. She had fought as hard as she could, saved who she could save, and gathered evidence that should have been enough to destroy Judge Abernathy's empire of suffering. But sometimes, even when you did everything right, the monster still won. Sarah's hand moved weakly against the surgical table, her fingers searching for something to hold on to as consciousness returned. Margaret took her sister's hand in both of hers, feeling the fragile warmth of life that she'd managed to preserve, and realized that even in apparent defeat, some victories were worth fighting for. The question now was whether those small victories would be enough to sustain her through whatever came next. The truth emerged not with a thunderclap of revelation, but with the quiet authority of a dying woman's final words. As Margaret held Sarah's hand and listened to her father's poisonous lies gaining traction with the federal officers, her half-sister's eyes fluttered open with startling clarity. "The Denver facility," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. "Basement. Under the courthouse. 37 women. Still there." Her grip on Margaret's hand tightened with desperate urgency. "He's moving them tonight. Trained to California, sold to mining camps." Marshall Thompson heard every word. The experienced lawman's face went ashen as the implications crashed home. If Judge Abernathy was indeed planning to transport women that very evening, time was running out for victims who might never be found again. "Miss, are you saying there are women being held captive right now?" Thompson's voice cut through Judge Abernathy's continued protests about his daughter's mental state. Sarah's nod was barely perceptible, but her eyes held the weight of absolute truth. Maps in the envelope. Building. Blueprints. Guard. Schedules. Everything. Margaret's hands shook as she opened the leather envelope Sarah had given her, spreading documents across the wooden steps. Among the financial records and correspondence were detailed architectural drawings of the Denver courthouse, annotated in Sarah's careful handwriting with guard rotations, entry points, and the location of hidden rooms that shouldn't exist in a legitimate government building. "My God," Dr. Morehouse breathed, studying the blueprints over Margaret's shoulder. "It's a maze down there. Underground chambers, multiple exits, holding cells disguised as storage rooms." Judge Abernathy's facade finally cracked completely as he realized the scope of evidence his daughters had assembled. "That girl is a known prostitute and criminal," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of paternal concern. "She's been wanted by Denver authorities for theft and vagrancy. You can't possibly believe the ravings of a dying whore over the sworn testimony of a federal judge." The silence that followed his outburst was deafening. Even the Pinkertons who'd been supporting him began exchanging uncertain glances, disturbed by the venom in his voice when speaking about a wounded 16-year-old girl. Marshal Thompson studied the documents with growing horror, his practiced eye recognizing authentic governmental seals and official stamps among the papers. These building modifications, they were approved through official channels, signed off on by city planning, funded through judicial budgets. His voice carried the weight of a man realizing the depth of corruption in his own system. Judge Abernathy, these documents suggest you've been using federal funds to construct holding facilities for human trafficking. Fabrications! Judge Abernathy's voice rose to a shout. Forged documents created by criminals to frame an innocent man. Marshal, I demand you arrest these people immediately. But his protests fell on increasingly deaf ears as Marshal Thompson continued examining the evidence. Bank records showed massive transfers between Judge Abernathy's personal accounts and known criminal enterprises. Correspondence revealed negotiations for merchandise and discussions of inventory management that could only refer to human beings. Most damning of all were the medical records. Dozens of death certificates signed by corrupt physicians documenting deaths that had occurred in Judge Abernathy's hidden facilities. There's something else, Margaret said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. The mercury poisoning I mentioned earlier. It wasn't just to keep me compliant. My father has been experimenting with chemical control methods on trafficked women. The medical records in that envelope include documentation of dozens of women who died from mercury, arsenic, and opium overdoses while in his custody. The words hung in the desert air like a death sentence. Even hardened Pinkertons and federal officers who'd seen the worst of frontier violence looked sick at the implications. Judge Abernathy hadn't just been trafficking women. He'd been using them as test subjects for methods of chemical control and elimination. Doctor. Morehouse's voice shook with rage as he added his testimony. I've treated 17 women who escaped from Judge Abernathy's facilities over the past 3 years. Every one of them showed signs of systematic poisoning, sexual assault, and psychological torture. Several died despite our best efforts, their bodies too damaged by the chemical experimentation to survive. These are lies. Judge Abernathy's desperation was palpable now, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. Marshal, you know my reputation. 20 years of distinguished service to federal law enforcement. Are you going to destroy my career based on the fabrications of criminals and prostitutes? But Marshal Thompson was no longer listening to Judge Abernathy's protests. He was studying a particular document that had caught his attention, a letter bearing the official seal of the Territorial Governor's Office, authorizing Judge Abernathy to establish special detention facilities for the temporary housing of relocated individuals during territorial expansion activities. This authorization, Thompson said slowly, his voice heavy with understanding. It's dated 3 days after the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek. You used the military action as cover to establish your trafficking network. The pieces of Judge Abernathy's empire fell into place with sickening clarity. The judge had exploited the chaos and displacement following military actions against indigenous communities, using his legal authority to relocate women and children who then disappeared into his trafficking network. What appeared to be legitimate government business was actually systematic kidnapping operating under the cover of federal law. Sarah's whispered voice cut through the horrified silence. The train leaves Denver at midnight. 37 women will disappear forever. If you don't stop it. Marshal Thompson checked his pocket watch with grim urgency. It was already past noon, and Denver was a hard day's ride from their current location. Even if they left immediately, Reaching the courthouse in time to prevent the transport would require pushing horses and men to their absolute limits. Judge Abernathy, Thompson's voice carried the full authority of federal law. You are under arrest for human trafficking, conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States government. Your crimes against the people of these territories constitute acts of war against civilian populations. The effect of Thompson's words on the assembled forces was immediate and decisive. Federal officers who had been uncertain about their loyalties now moved with purpose, surrounding Judge Abernathy and his remaining Pinkerton supporters. The careful standoff that had threatened violence all morning resolved into the methodical arrest of war criminals. But Judge Abernathy wasn't finished. As federal handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he turned to Margaret with a smile that chilled her blood. "You think you've won, my dear daughter? You think exposing my small operations will matter in the end?" His laugh was cold and bitter. "I'm just one man in a network that spans this entire continent. Railroad barons, mining corporations, territorial governors, they all profit from what I provide. Cut off one head, and two more will take its place." Margaret felt the weight of his words settling over her like a shroud. Even in defeat, Judge Abernathy was revealing that his crimes were part of something far larger and more entrenched than anyone had imagined. The evidence she and Sarah had gathered might bring down one trafficking operation, but the system that enabled it would continue to destroy lives across the American frontier. "Maybe," Margaret replied, her voice stronger than she felt. "But every woman you would have hurt tonight will live to see another sunrise. Every child you would have stolen will grow up free. Sometimes that's enough." As federal officers led Judge Abernathy away in chains, his parting words echoed across the settlement like a curse. "The train will leave Denver with or without me, Margaret. 37 women will disappear tonight, and their blood will be on your hands for the rest of your life." The truth of his statement hit Margaret like a physical blow. Even with her father in custody, his trafficking network would continue operating. The women Sarah had died trying to save would be transported to mining camps in California, sold into sexual slavery, and worked to death in conditions that made Judge Abernathy's facilities seem merciful by comparison. Margaret looked down at Sarah's still form, her half-sister's breathing shallow but steady after the emergency surgery. The girl had risked everything to gather evidence that could save 37 strangers, and now she lay dying while the women she'd tried to protect remained trapped in basement cells beneath a courthouse in Denver. In that moment, Margaret realized that exposing her father's crimes had been only the beginning of her fight for justice. The real battle would be reaching Denver in time to prevent the midnight transport, a race against time that would require her to risk everything she'd found in her new life to save women she'd never met. The question was whether she had the strength to leave Sarah's bedside and ride into almost certain death for the sake of strangers who might already be beyond saving. The decision to leave Sarah's bedside and ride toward Denver came not from courage, but from the crushing weight of her half-sister's whispered words, "Promise me they won't die, because I was too weak to save them." Margaret's hands trembled as she checked Sarah's pulse one final time, memorizing the steady rhythm that meant her surgery had succeeded. Dr. Morehouse would care for Sarah with the same devotion he'd shown Margaret's mother years ago, but the 37 women trapped beneath Denver's courthouse had no one else to depend on. "I'm going with you," Sam announced, checking his rifle and securing extra ammunition to his saddle. "This isn't something you face alone." Margaret shook her head, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "If we don't make it back, Sarah will need you. The community will need you. I won't be responsible for destroying everything we've built here." "And I won't let you ride into hell without backup," Sam replied firmly. "We're partners now, Margaret, in medicine, in love, and in fighting monsters like your father," Marshal Thompson approached with a grim expression, his weathered face showing the strain of the morning's revelations. "Miss Abernathy, I'm assembling a federal task force to intercept that train, but we're cutting it mighty close. Denver's 18 hours hard riding from here, and it's already past 1 o'clock. "Then we leave now," Margaret said, accepting the medical supplies Dr. Morehouse pressed into her hands. "Those women have been waiting long enough." The ride toward Denver became a desperate race against time and geography. Margaret's horse, a sturdy mare named Patience, had never been pushed so hard or fast, but the animal seemed to sense the urgency of their mission. Behind her rode Sam, Marshal Thompson, and 6 federal officers, their faces set with the grim determination of men who understood they were riding toward either justice or their own deaths. As they crossed the first ridge, Margaret allowed herself one backward glance at the settlement that had become her home. The buildings looked small and fragile against the vast desert landscape, but she could see figures moving purposefully between them, women going about the business of healing and survival, children playing games that prepared them for an uncertain future, men working to build something better than what they'd left behind. This was what her father's network sought to destroy. Not just individual lives, but the possibility that people could choose their own families, create their own communities, and heal from the wounds inflicted by those who saw human beings as commodities to be bought and sold. The landscape blurred past as they pushed their horses to the edge of endurance. Margaret's medical training helped her monitor both her own condition and that of their mounts, calling for brief rest stops when absolutely necessary, but never allowing more than the minimum time required to prevent total collapse. During one such stop, as they watered their horses at a creek that would be their last source of fresh water before Denver, Marshal Thompson shared intelligence that made Margaret's blood run cold. "I sent a telegraph ahead to my contacts in Denver," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of running water. "The courthouse basement isn't just a holding facility. It's a processing center. Women are sorted by age, health, and other characteristics before being shipped to different destinations." Margaret's hands stilled on her horse's bridle. "Sorted how?" Thompson's expression was grim. "Younger, healthier women go to mining camps and railroad construction sites. Older women, or those too damaged by previous abuse, are sent to facilities where life expectancy is measured in weeks rather than months." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. The 37 women waiting in Denver's basement weren't just facing transportation to a life of sexual slavery. They were facing systematic evaluation that would determine whether they lived long enough to suffer for years or died quickly in facilities designed to extract maximum profit from human misery before disposal. "There's more," Thompson continued. "The train your father mentioned isn't the only transport leaving tonight. According to my sources, there are 3 separate shipments departing Denver between midnight and dawn. We're not just racing to save 37 women, we're racing to prevent the largest single trafficking operation in territorial history." Sam's voice cut through Margaret's horror with practical urgency. "How many women total?" "Over 200, Thompson replied. "Gathered from operations across 6 territories, all being moved simultaneously to prevent exactly the kind of rescue operation we're attempting." Margaret felt the weight of impossibility settling over their mission like a suffocating blanket. Even if they reached Denver in time, even if they successfully located and liberated the women from the courthouse basement, 200 other victims would disappear into a system designed to ensure they were never found again. "We can't save them all," she whispered, the words tasting like ashes in her mouth. "No," Sam agreed, his voice gentle but firm. "But we can save the ones we can reach, and sometimes that has to be enough." As they remounted and continued their desperate ride, Margaret found herself thinking about the women whose faces she would never see, whose names she would never know, whose suffering would continue in places she could never reach. The scale of her father's network suddenly felt overwhelming, a hydra of corruption and cruelty that would continue consuming lives long after Judge Harrison Abernathy died in federal prison. But then she remembered Sarah's words about the maps and building plans hidden in the evidence envelope. Her half-sister hadn't just gathered proof of their father's crimes, she'd created a roadmap for dismantling his entire operation. The architectural drawings, guard schedules, and financial records weren't just evidence for prosecution. They were intelligence that could guide future rescue operations. The sun was setting behind them as Denver's lights became visible on the horizon, a sprawling constellation of gas lamps and electric illumination that spoke of civilization and progress. But Margaret now knew that beneath that veneer of respectability lay a network of horrors that would make frontier bandits seem like choir boys by comparison. "Whatever happens in there," Sam said as they approached the city limits, "I want you to know that meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You turned what was supposed to be a business transaction into the love story I never thought I'd have." Margaret's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't afford to feel. "If we don't make it out—" "We will," Sam interrupted firmly. "We have to. Those women are counting on us, and Sarah died trying to give us the information we needed to save them." But even as Margaret nodded agreement, she could feel the weight of probable failure pressing down on her shoulders. They were 8 people riding against an entrenched network with unlimited resources and federal protection. The odds of successfully infiltrating the courthouse, locating the hidden chambers, liberating dozens of traumatized women, and escaping before the midnight trains departed seemed impossibly small. As they entered Denver's outskirts, Margaret realized that win or lose, her life would never be the same again. She'd transformed from Judge Abernathy's disappointing daughter into something he'd never anticipated. A woman with the medical skills to heal the damage he'd inflicted, the moral courage to stand against his empire of suffering, and the desperate love for family and community that made any sacrifice worthwhile. The courthouse loomed ahead in the darkness, its windows glowing with the warm light of oil lamps that belied the horrors hidden in its depths. Somewhere beneath those stone foundations, 37 women waited in cells they didn't know existed, preparing for a journey that would end with their deaths in California mining camps. Margaret checked her medical supplies one final time, whispered a prayer for Sarah's recovery, and prepared to discover whether love and determination were enough to overcome a system designed to crush both. The final battle for her soul, and the souls of women she'd never met, was about to begin. For our listeners who remember when America meant standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, Margaret's story reminds us that real courage isn't the absence of fear. It's loving someone enough to act despite that fear. In our golden years, we understand that true wealth isn't measured in inheritance or social standing, but in the lives we touch and the love we choose to give. Margaret found what so many of us still search for, a place where she was valued, not for what she looked like, but for the healing she could bring to broken hearts and bodies. Her journey from rejection to belonging, from shame to purpose, speaks to every soul who's ever felt invisible or unworthy. Sometimes God doesn't rescue us from our circumstances. He gives us the strength to rescue others from theirs. What family wounds are you still carrying from your own childhood? Have you found your own settlement where you're loved exactly as you are?